Hola amigos, welcome back for our next session of notes on the tissues. Today we are going to be starting our third part, which is about muscular and nervous tissue, and we're going to include some information about membranes. But for today's lecture, we're just going to learn about the muscular tissues. So let's go ahead and get started. Our objectives, we are going to look at the structure, location, and mode of control of the three types of muscular tissue. So that's going to be our goal for today. Our next lesson, we are going to learn about the structure and function of nervous tissue, and then we're going to learn about the membranes, as mentioned. All right, so let's begin with muscles. So muscle tissue has a very unique structure in that it is made of a lot of cells, kind of similar to how epithelial tissue is made of all cells. There is little to no matrix or space in between these cells. So we have these things that are called myocytes. And so literally the word myocyte comes from myo, meaning muscle, and cyte, meaning cell. So they're just muscle cells. But when we look at these muscle cells, they look something like this. They're very long and cylindrical in some cases. Sometimes they're kind of like long and expanded out like this. But in all cases, they are always very, very long tissues, very long cells. So we call them fibers because they're kind of like strands. So if you've ever cooked like a pot roast before or any sort of like meat that has been cooked for like a long time, like in a crock pot or something like that, you know how like you can like separate it and it like it makes like strings of meat, kind of like falls apart. We always talk about like, oh, the meat falls off the bone. So when we hear about that, that's what we're looking at. Literally, like a whole bunch of these cells all bundled together, and then that's like one of those little like meat strings that you see. So you can actually peel apart meat and see bundles of these cells. Now, of course, cells are microscopic, so you can't see one of them, but you're seeing a bunch of these like long strands when you do that. Okay, so it's mostly made out of cells, almost entirely made out of cells called fibers. It's innervated, which of course we know means that it does have nerves. And if you think about it, you have to do a lot of controlling of your muscles. So you have to have some nervous tissue that comes down and connects onto this muscle in order to tell it to go. So we always see that muscle tissue is going to be innervated. It is also very vascular, which of course means that it has blood. And this, of course, is because your muscles are using a lot of energy. So we have to be able to bring, things like oxygen and sugars and stuff like that into the muscles in order to keep them moving. One interesting thing about your muscles is that, we talk about people being in shape and having endurance and stuff like that. So the more that you use your muscles, not only do they get stronger, but you actually grow larger blood vessels into them. So your body grows like these blood vessels on demand so that you can deliver more oxygen and more nutrients into that muscle tissue. So you kind of increase your vascularity as you become more in shape. So the more you use a muscle, the more vascular it becomes. If you stop using that muscle, not only does the muscle get weaker, but the vascularity of that tissue also decreases. And so the main function of muscles is movement. And there's a couple different ways that they move, but the point is that they all move something. And they do that by contracting. So this long muscle cell contracts, it pulls in towards the center, kind of like an accordion. This cell would also do the same thing. The ends would pull in and it would make like a little ball. So this would be like a relaxed muscle, and then that same muscle would be contracted down into a much smaller area. This little guy would look kind of something like this. It would contract in um, when it's being used, and this would be like the relaxed phase. So all muscles do movement through contraction. Now, as kind of like a part of that, this is like a little bit of physics. So basically, when the muscles contract anyway, so when they contract, there's a lot of friction, and that friction leads to heat. So, as kind of like a byproduct of contraction, your muscles also produce heat. So that's like their secondary function. And so that's why, like, the more you use your muscles, the hotter your body gets. Kind of like your car, like your car produces heat. The more the engine runs, it produces excess heat, and you have to use a radiator to dump that heat out. All right, so there are three main types of skeletal or of muscle tissue, and the first one is called skeletal muscle. And this one's really easy to remember because it's usually, in almost all cases, connected to your skeleton. And the reason why is that it's involved with moving your bones. So if you think about it, like when you move like your biceps, you're going to contract that to move the bones of your forearm and move your hand up closer to your shoulder. We call that flexing. Okay. Um, Basically, if you were to like name muscles, like if I said, hey, name a muscle for me, you guys would probably be like, oh, biceps, triceps, quads, abs, all sorts of things like that, obliques, lats, any sort of muscle group that you could name. Did I miss any quads? Oh, hamstrings. Basically, all the muscles that you know the names for are all going to be skeletal muscles. So these are the ones that you would like go to the gym to work out. They move your skeleton, they basically move your body. What do all these things have in common? They have voluntary control. So you can voluntarily turn them on or off. So this is kind of like a conscious thing. So you can consciously turn these muscles on or off. So you can decide, do I want to flex my biceps? Do I want to move my triceps? Do I want to use my quads? You control all of that. So it's voluntary. Your conscious part of your brain controls it. Now, sometimes it's a little less conscious. So for example, when you breathe, your diaphragm is a skeletal muscle. How do we know? Well, even though you mostly breathe without thinking about it, so it just kind of happens. Like you don't have to think about breathing, you don't have to concentrate. It's on autopilot. You can also hold your breath. You can make yourself breathe faster, so you can hyperventilate yourself. So if I wanted to like get a bunch of air, I could be like, great. I'm using my diaphragm voluntarily. The thing is that the diaphragm has like a backup system that basically allows it to run on autopilot. But because I can control it, it's a voluntary muscle. Same thing, if you think about like your eye muscles, because you can voluntarily move your eyes, there's your skeletal muscles. Same thing with like your mouth and your tongue, because you can control how they move, they also count as containing skeletal muscles. All right, so anything that you're able to voluntarily control. Now let's get to some weird stuff. Okay, ready? So in your bladder, you have a muscle that like holds back your pee. So you can like hold your pee in. That is a skeletal muscle. And when you choose that you want to let yourself pee, you let that skeletal muscle relax and you pee. Also, same thing with your bowels. Like obviously, like as soon as you need to poop, you don't just do it, unless you're like a baby or like a really old person. You're able to hold all of that poop inside of you until you're ready to let it out. So you can literally hold it. And so those are all considered voluntary control. So things that you can consciously control. They're all striated. And what striated means is that means that they are striped. So if you were to look at these under the microscope, and I'll show you a picture of these in a minute, skeletal muscle cells look like these long cylinders, and they have bands or stripes on them of like light and dark areas. And these things that you're looking at here actually are the proteins. So of course we know that we need proteins to grow our muscles strong. These bands are how the proteins are arranged. And if you remember how we talked about like dense regular connective tissue, how it was very strong in one direction, these little bands actually contract together. And so each one of these bands is going to contract and give this a very strong force pulling inward. And so these stripes make this tissue strong. So striated, striped, and strong all go together. And they're also multinucleated. So once again, I'm going to draw one of these muscle fibers. Whoops. And if you look out on the outside, you'd actually see a bunch of nuclei out here. And there would actually be like little lumps for these nuclei. They're not actually this big, so it's kind of dramatic. And then we have all those proteins in the middle. So what happens is that when you were like a little baby, you actually had these little separate cells that looked like this. And then you'd have like another separate cell that would look like this. And this is like fetal, into like infant life. And then these guys combine together and they merge and form one single cell. So the reason why these fibers are so long and so huge is that they are actually made from multiple cells that have fused together. And so by the time you're an adult and you have full like adult strength, you have these really long, strong cells. And so it says here, hashtag sartorius BIG. The sartorius is the longest muscle. This is just for fun in your entire body, and it's in your leg. And so this long muscle literally goes from like your hip, goes across your thigh, and goes to the inside of your knee. And it's kind of shaped like this. And so think about that, from the outside of your hip, like where you put your hands on your hip, all the way to the inside of your knee. That's one muscle going all the way across your thigh like that. So they can be very, very long cells. And literally, there are some cells that like just go for like incredible lengths. But because they are cells, they are thinner than a human hair, and you can't see them. So you can't see a single cell because they're so skinny. All right, so this is showing us a picture of some skeletal muscles. And in this microscope slide, we've chopped off these cells. So they continue beyond the picture, so they just keep going. But you can see all those little bands. So of course we know that is striated. So these little striations. And here's our little nuclei on the side. So this is actually like the cell membrane for this cell keeps going. And you can see here's a bunch. So this next muscle fiber, here's some of its nuclei, maybe over here. And then the one next to it has some nuclei right next to it. So they have their nuclei kind of pushed off to the side, and you can see how they form from multiple cells. And so we know that this muscle is going to contract in this direction. All these little fibers are going to kind of be like an accordion, and they're going to pull together. And when the muscle's fully contracted, see all the little like light bands? Those all disappear, and this whole thing becomes all these dark bands pressed together. And then it relaxes, it opens back up, and you can see the light and dark bands. So this is showing you one skeletal muscle. This happens to be what we call a pec. Great. The second type of muscle is called visceral, and we often use the word smooth for this, although that's a particular type, but we use the two pretty much interchangeably. And hopefully by now you've seen the word visceral a few times before, because visceral means organ. And so what's really nice is that this visceral term tells us where we find it. We find it in our organs, and one thing that's also considered an organ of your body are your blood vessels. So a blood vessel is also considered to be an organ. And so you know how like when you get embarrassed, like your skin gets like flushed, or some people more than others, maybe this doesn't happen to you so much, but people become like really red, or like when you exercise, you become really red. The reason for that is that you are opening up these visceral muscles and allowing blood to flow to like the surface of your skin. And that's why you feel hot. That's why you feel like the heat radiating off your face maybe. But then later on, when you cool down or relax, you don't feel that anymore. That's why people become like pale sometimes, like, if you get scared or shocked or something like that. It's because these visceral muscles are controlling your blood flow. So visceral muscles are involuntary, so they are not conscious. So going back to my example, if you become embarrassed and you start blushing, you can't stop it. It just happens until you relax. Or if you exercise and you get hot and your skin becomes really hot and you can't control it. Same thing is inside of your organs. So for example, think about like your intestines for a minute. Have you ever had this happen where like you're sitting in a quiet room and maybe you're sitting near someone you like and you think they're cute, and all of a sudden your intestines are like blah, 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 and you have like all this like weird noise coming from like your stomach and your guts? Those are all controlled by involuntary skeletal or visceral muscle. So because it's visceral muscle, you can't stop your stomach from growling and gurgling and all that kind of stuff. Another example would be the pupils of your eyes. So when you look in the mirror and like if you're in a dark room, your pupils are like huge, right? But then if you turn the lights on, all of a sudden your pupils get like really small, and then it can go back and forth. This is an involuntary muscle. You can't control your pupils. So no matter how hard you try, if you get put into a dark room, your pupils get big. When you go into a bright room, your pupils get small. What's nice about this is you don't have to think about it. You don't have to be like, eyes, adjust pupil size, and then make them do it. They just do it automatically all day, every day. Same thing with your intestines. You don't have to think about digestion because it just happens behind the scenes. So the intestines are a great example. Stomach's a great example of something like this. Your pupils are great. Another one is in your skin, you have these little things called erector pili that produce your goosebumps. And same thing, you can't control when you get goosebumps. They just kind of happen automatically, and then eventually they'll wear off. You have no control over this. So involuntary, not conscious control. You can neither start nor stop this voluntarily, okay? It just happens. Now, there are parts of your brain, it's like the subconscious parts of your brain that do these. So if you become scared, you might get goosebumps, okay? When people tell a lie, I don't know if you guys know this, but their pupils actually dilate. Their pupils get bigger by a little bit. So if you look at someone right in the eye while they're telling you a lie, you might see like their pupils get a little bit larger. That's because they're actually becoming scared of getting caught when they tell you this lie. But you can't control that no matter how hard you try, okay? These are not striated, so they are not striped. No stripes at all. They're very smooth, and therefore they are not strong. So if you think about it, you're probably not picking up heavy loads with like your skin or your pupils or your intestines or your stomach. Like, these things are used for movement, but it's not like really strong movement. Okay. Oh, here's another good example. This is really gross. Your esophagus is also part of this too. And so, have you ever like gotten sick and you have to throw up? You feel it coming on, hopefully, but you can't stop it. Like once your body's like, I'm going to puke, you're just like, here it comes. And you can try to like aim or you can try to like get to some place that's safe to do it. But once it starts, it's just going to continue. That's a visceral muscle. And it doesn't take that much force to like empty your stomach. So it's just like, blah, there you go. And these cells are very small. They have one nucleus. So these have like kind of the smallest cells in the muscle area. So if you look at these, they have a nucleus. That nucleus is kind of surrounded by this little like UFO looking thing. And these guys kind of contract in this direction, but they also contract a little bit in this direction as well. And they form themselves into like a little ball when they're contracted, and then they go back to their regular shape. So let's take a look at some of these. So here's some visceral muscle. How did I do for my drawing, huh? This happens to be inside of an artery. So your arteries have muscles to adjust their size so they can be larger or smaller as needed. And you can see these smooth muscle cells, there's no striations, and there's a whole bunch of cells. Look how little they are. And they have little plump nuclei, kind of like most of your cells do. They're not weird like those skeletal muscle cells. All right, moving right along. The last type of muscle tissue is called cardiac. And of course, anytime you see anything that starts with cardio, cardia, cardi B, just kidding, that's always going to mean heart, right? So your cardiac muscle is only found in the heart. That's the only place it's located. It's a very specialized tissue. It has what is called intrinsic control. And intrinsic control means that the control is inside of it. So literally, it controls itself. Now, this gets a little confusing, so bear with me. Um, Intrinsic control is a like special type of involuntary. So, in other words, if you've ever done something and you've gotten scared and you feel your heart beating really fast, you cannot control it. It's involuntary. You can't slow your heart down if you want to. You can't speed your heart up. It doesn't have any sort of conscious control. So it is involuntary. But the weird thing is that in absence of any signals from your brain, your heart sets its own rhythm. You actually have a pacemaker inside of your heart. And if you ever have seen a pacemaker or heard about people have them implanted, literally pretend like this is what your heart looks like. It's like a little box they stick under your skin, and they stick a wire down into your heart to turn that on, and it sends signals. And the reason for that is that the heart controls itself. Now, your brain also sends nerves down to the heart to say, hey, I want you to speed up or slow down because I need more blood or less blood. But in absence of those signals, if you cut this nerve, the heart will keep beating on its own, which is kind of weird. All right, so it's intrinsic control, and that's very unique. It's striated, so of course that means that it is striped and strong. And if you think about it, obviously you want your heart muscle to be strong, right? You don't want a weak heart. It is a branched cell structure, so I'm going to draw this down here. Cardiac muscle cells kind of look like mostly like a letter Y or like a letter X. And so here's the cell. It's single nucleated. So there's one single nucleus. You can see that because these are smaller cells. And then each cell that's connected onto that forms either like an X shape or a Y shape. And the reason why that's important is that they form like a network. So if one cell contracts, it sends the signal to the next cell. This is then connected to like yet another cell that's kind of got this weird Y shape to it. And so they form sort of like this network of cells. So then like the next cell over here would like, oh, I'm going to totally mess this up. Oh, wow, I messed that up horribly. Ooh, man. Okay, there we go. That's better. So there'd be like another cell here. And of course, they're striated, so they all have stripes. So they're all super stripy and strong. But the whole point is this branched cell structure. If you think about your heart, the whole thing contracts inward. So like the top, bottom, sides, everything is pulling in towards the center. So all these cells, when they contract, this cell is going to get smaller and pull on the cell next to it. It's also going to contract and pull inward. And then this cell is also going to contract and pull inward. So they all like tighten up. It's kind of like a mesh bag, like when you pull the drawstring and it pulls together. That's what we're seeing here. So this branched cell structure helps it to like pump the blood, okay? So it forms like a network for pumping. is what you could say about this. Now, if you look at this drawing I did, when I drew the ends of these, did you see I made them look kind of like real jagged and rough, at least for the most part, when I remember to do so? Okay. So what we see is that where these cells come together, the cell membrane is really convoluted and folded. And remember, we talked about this with microvilli. Anytime you see something that's folded, it's to increase their surface area. And this little thing is called an intercalated disc. And basically what happens is that we're increasing the surface area, okay? So we'll say more SA, that's for surface area, not scalar area. Don't get all crazy. But what's going to happen is here, by increasing that surface area, a couple things happen. It allows these cells to bind, so they stick together, okay? And so basically, more surface area allows more attachment. So we'll say more adhesion. And what's good about that is that when these cells contract, they're contracting very forcefully. We don't want them to rip apart, okay? So it helps them to stay together. And so that means no broken hearts. All right, we don't want your heart to rip apart. And if you think about it, your heart's not connected to anything but itself. Like all these cardiac muscle cells just form like a big ring around the heart. And so when they pull, they're just pulling on each other. So they need to have this. Another thing about intercalated discs is it allows signals to pass. So one of the things that your muscles use is they use sodium ions. Sodium ions, there's actually like little tiny channels here that are able to flow right across because these really tight junctions, and sodium is able to go right through. So it actually helps to maintain the heartbeat as well. And there's actually little things in here called gap junctions that help with that too, but we'll talk about that when we actually get to the heart. So they help to maintain the heartbeats as they go through. Okay, so basically this whole thing acts as like a network, almost like dominoes. Like one muscle contracts, it sends a signal to the next one to contract, it sends the next one to contract, and they all contract together. So let's take a look and see what this actually looks like. So here is some cardiac muscle tissue, or so we're looking at a heart, of course. And if you look, you can see very faintly little striations, and you can see these little dark regions here, okay? And this is just where the cells are overlapping, and that's our intercalated disc is what we're seeing there. And you can see it's labeled over here too. You can see there's the single nuclei, so each one of these cells just gets one big plump nucleus because they're smaller cells. And you can see a bit of a branch structure. So each one of these kind of like branches off and connects to a couple cells. So this diagram shows a little bit better. It looks a lot nicer and cleaner than mine does, but you see each cell is hooked up to several other cells to form a big network. So you would just stick like another cell over here and give it like a little branch and so on. All right. So a little bit, just to kind of reiterate what we were talking about here. Intrinsic control, it's a little different from involuntary. It's very similar. A lot of people mess this up. You can't control it, so they both have that in common. But the difference is intrinsic controls itself with advice from the brain. So the brain's kind of like, hey, if you could just go ahead and beat a little faster, that would be great. And the heart's like, yeah, okay, whatever. But if you don't get that input, the heart just maintains its own heartbeat, which is kind of wild. So it's kind of like, your parents might like suggest that you do things. They might try to control your life, but really you control yourself. So you are intrinsic. You control yourself with advice from other people. All right. And that brings us to the very end. That's all, folks. Hopefully you guys learned a lot about muscle tissues. And, don't forget that you're going to answer 5 questions at the end here. So make sure you guys answer those questions. And if you have any other questions for me, just please let me know. Thank you and good luck.